Shawn and John, both 32, same city, same $80,000 a year. After years of being responsible with money, cutting subscriptions they forgot to cut, and convincing themselves that the store brand cereal was basically the same as the name brand, both of them have saved $80,000. Financially, they're carbon copies. Personality-wise, couldn't be more different. Shawn wants stability in everything he does. He likes knowing what's coming next, having a plan. He dreams of a place that's permanently his, a garage for tools he may never actually learn to use, a backyard he'll gradually become unreasonably attached to. He wants the freedom to make a space completely his own. John values flexibility. He likes keeping his options open, knowing he can pivot whenever he wants. 5 years from now is a mystery to him, and honestly, he likes it that way. The idea of being locked into one address for 30 years makes him more anxious than it probably should. Those two completely different personalities lead them to two completely different choices. Shawn buys, John keeps renting. For the next 20 years, we track every mortgage payment, every rent hike, every repair bill, every dollar John saves by renting and puts to work in the market. Then we find out what happens to two people who started with the same income, the same savings, but chose two totally different paths. Shawn and John are still renting in the same mid-sized American city. After months of looking, dozens of listings, and more house tour than Shawn cares to remember, he finds the one. 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, a small backyard, and a garage big enough for exercise equipment he'll never touch. He buys it. The price tag reads $350,000. Shawn put $70,000 down, exactly 20%, leaving a $280,000 mortgage. But the down payment isn't everything. There are closing costs, lender fees, title fees, inspections, prepaid taxes, and roughly 46 documents he signs without understanding most of them. Closing costs typically land between 2% and 5% of the purchase price. On a $350,000 home, that means anywhere from $7,000 to $17,500 just to close the deal. For our comparison, let's say Shawn's closing costs hit $10,000. So before he even moves in, Shawn has poured $80,000 into this house. $70,000 for the down payment and another $10,000 in closing costs. He takes out a 30-year fixed mortgage at 7%. His monthly principal and interest comes to about $1,863, but that's just the loan. Ownership brings other monthly bills. Property taxes run about $350, homeowner's insurance adds $150, and Shawn budgets roughly $290 for maintenance, roughly 1% of the home's value annually. That puts his initial monthly housing cost at around $2,653. John runs the numbers differently, though. He rents a comparable 3-bedroom place down the street for $2,000 a month, no property taxes, no insurance bills. And when the water heater quits, that's the landlord's headache, not John's. That frees up $653 in his pocket each month. For a second, that money starts looking like a trip to Thailand. But John holds firm. He puts every spare dollar into the market instead. The $80,000 he skipped buying with goes straight into a broad stock market index fund. The $653 he saves each month follows the same path. At first, the bet pays off. John lives in a similar house, spends less monthly, and watches his money grow in the market. Right about now, someone's going to jump in with the same tired line, but John's just burning $2,000 on rent every month. Shawn's building real equity with his mortgage. Technically, that argument holds water, but here's where it falls apart. In those first few years, equity doesn't build quickly, not even close. In Shawn's first month, mortgage interest alone eats up $1,633. Add $350 for property taxes, $150 for insurance, and $290 set aside for repairs. His total monthly housing bill comes to $2,653. Only $230 of that actually grows his equity. The remaining $2,423, that's just the price of owning the place. John forks over $2,000 for rent. No equity there, sure. But calling rent a waste of money while treating mortgage interest, taxes, insurance, and maintenance as if they're somehow investments, that's a convenient way to run the numbers. 3 years pass. You've made 36 mortgage payments and stacked up some equity. You've also discovered the first rule of homeownership. Every weird sound that comes from the house now has a dollar sign attached. One weekend, the water heater gives out. You find a YouTube video titled "Easy Water Heater Fix." Anyone can do this. 4 hours later, you're on the phone with a professional. The fix runs a few $100. Lucky for you, that's exactly what your maintenance budget was for. 3 years of payments have trimmed your mortgage from $280,000 down to $270,835. You've knocked out just over $9,000 in principal. Now let's say the place climbed at 3% to 4% each year. That puts the current value somewhere between $382,000 and $394,000, which means your equity sits around $112,000 to $123,000. That's actual wealth. Over on John's side, $72,000 in rent left his account, but that original $80,000 never stopped working. At a 10% yearly return, it's grown to roughly $106,000. John also kept dropping the monthly difference into investments. Throw in those contributions and their growth, and his portfolio checks in around $130,000. So after 3 years, the numbers look surprisingly even. You've got solid equity in a home. John has a solid portfolio. You can paint the living room any color you want. John can pack up next month if he feels like it. But as time keeps moving, the costs on each side start shifting. Your principal and interest stay locked in. That doesn't mean ownership expenses stay flat, though. When your property's value climbs, so do your property taxes. Insurance premiums tick upward, and as the house ages, repairs get pricier. John faces his own climbing costs, though. Rent. He starts at $2,000 a month, but every year it inchworms higher. $2,000 becomes $2,060, then about $2,122, then more the year after that. Nothing about the actual house has changed, just the number leaving John's account each month. Turns out his landlord is also a fan of compound growth. At roughly 3% annual increases, that $653 monthly edge John began with slowly starts to evaporate. Here's where time turns the tables for Shawn. His mortgage payment stays locked in on both principal and interest while John watches rent climb every year. But John still has one big thing working in his favor that we haven't talked about yet. That original $80,000 John put down has been sitting in the stock market this whole time, growing the entire way. And that brings us to one of the biggest factors in this comparison: opportunity cost. At a 10% annual return, that $80,000 has the potential to grow dramatically over the next 2 decades. And that's before counting any additional monthly investments. That doesn't mean Shawn is losing out. His money went toward a home that was also appreciating and building equity. But that $80,000 had an alternative use, and an honest comparison has to count it. Fast forward to year 10. Shawn is 42 now. His house climbed 3% to 4% each year, landing somewhere between $470,000 and $518,000. After a decade of mortgage payments, his loan balance sits around $240,000. That leaves him with roughly $230,000 to $278,000 in equity. He walks the property like a man who owns about half of every brick. Over those 10 years, he spent money keeping things running. Some repairs improved the place. Some just stopped it from falling apart. John kept investing. His original $80,000 grew at a 10% annual return to roughly $27,000. He also invested the money he saved each month by renting. That monthly gap started at $653, but shrank as his rent climbed 3% every year. Add those monthly investments and their growth to his original $80,000, and John's portfolio sits around $290,000. So after a decade, John still leads in liquid financial assets, but something shifted. His rent isn't $2,000 anymore. After 10 years of 3% increases, it inches toward $2,700 a month. Shawn's principal and interest payment stays around $1,863, $20 years down the road. Both men are 52 now. Shawn's house, growing at 3% to 4% each year, sits somewhere between $632,000 and $767,000 in value. The mortgage, down to about $160,000. That leaves Shawn with roughly $472,000 to $607,000 in equity tied up in the property. John's investments kept compounding for 2 full decades. His initial $80,000 alone swelled to around $538,000, assuming a 10% annual return. That figure doesn't even count the extra money he poured in during the years when renting cost him less. Factor in those monthly contributions and their returns, and John's portfolio comes to roughly $750,000. Pure net worth, John wins after 20 years, but their situations feel completely different. John's money moves. Shawn can't exactly sell 8% of the kitchen, not without raising some eyebrows from anyone checking out the place later. John still carries one expense that never goes away: Rent. After 20 years of 3% annual bumps, his original $2,000 payment has climbed to about $3,600 per month. Shawn's mortgage has only 10 years remaining. John's rent has no finish line in sight. Now here's what nobody talks about with John's plan. He actually had to invest that difference. Every single month for decades, when the market climbed, he invested. When it fell 30%, he invested. When the financial news started screaming about capitalism's death for the fourth time that decade, he invested anyway. The spreadsheet assumes perfect discipline. Human beings tend to have other ideas. That money meant for investing quietly became a nicer car, a vacation or two, a lifestyle that crept up just a bit. 10 years down the road, the portfolio that looked incredible on paper somehow never made it past the spreadsheet. A mortgage does something different. It forces you to save. Shawn never had to decide each month whether he felt like building equity. The bank already made that call, and behaviorally, that makes all the difference. But ownership has its own drawbacks. The first one is time. If Shawn had sold after just 3 years, the closing costs coming in, the selling costs going out, and those early mortgage payments heavy with interest could easily have chewed through most of his edge. Buying typically needs years before the math tips in your favor. The second issue is flexibility. Imagine this: several years down the road, both Shawn and John land incredible job offers in another state. John's choice is straightforward. He gives notice, packs up, and goes. Shawn can leave too, but he faces another decision first. He could sell the house, which means paying selling costs and hunting for a buyer, or he could rent the place out and move. The problem is he'd now have a mortgage on one property and rent in a new city, with a tenant who may or may not cover all his expenses. Any gap comes straight from Shawn's pocket, leaving him with less cash to set aside and invest. Then there's concentration risk. John holds a diversified portfolio spread across thousands of companies. Shawn owns one house on one street in one neighborhood in one city. If that area takes off, Shawn benefits. If the local economy falters, he can't rebalance by selling the upstairs bathroom. And finally, liquidity. John needs $20,000, he sells a slice of his portfolio. Shawn needs $20,000, he has to refinance, borrow against his equity, or eventually sell the place. Home equity is wealth, but it isn't easy to get your hands on, buying or renting. Which one's better for you? Honestly, it depends on your situation. Stay put long enough and buying starts to win. 7 to 10 years, maybe more, that gives transaction costs room to fade away. Principal paydown adds up. Your fixed payment holds steady while rents climb, and appreciation gets years to compound. Buying also shines when prices sit low compared to what you'd pay to rent. Here's one way to check. Take the home price, divide it by annual rent on a similar place. A $350,000 house against $24,000 in yearly rent, that works out to roughly 14.6. Once that number climbs above 20, renting typically starts looking better. But this ratio is just a shortcut. Mortgage rates, taxes, insurance, what you expect to earn, none of that goes away. High prices compared to rent make renting the smarter play. So does needing flexibility and actually putting that savings into investments instead of watching it vanish. But personal finance isn't about one perfect strategy. It's about knowing what you're trading. Shawn gave up liquidity and the ability to move for stability, leverage, and long-term control of his housing costs. John gave up housing certainty for flexibility, cash, and more money working in markets. Neither move was automatically smart. Neither was automatically dumb. The real decision hinges on two things. How long are you actually going to stay? Because if you buy and leave after 3 years, closing costs and fees can wipe you out. And if you rent, will you actually invest the difference? Because if you rent for 20 years and spend every dollar you saved, the whole investment advantage evaporates. Rent isn't automatically throwing money away. Renters write a check for housing. Homeowners write checks for interest, taxes, insurance, upkeep, and closing fees. Both pay for shelter, and owning does build serious wealth. But it's also a pricey asset you can't easily sell, with constant expenses, all your money tied up in one place, and a roof that sometimes hands you a $12,000 bill. The winner isn't always the homeowner. The winner isn't always the renter either. Shawn needed to stay long enough for buying to pay off. John needed to invest consistently enough for renting to pay off. 20 years later, the difference between them didn't come down to who bought and who rented. It came down to what they did after making that decision. Some of you are waiting for interest rates and house prices to both drop at the same time. In that case, I admire your optimism. If you liked today's video, please help us by subscribing to the channel. Hit the like button and tell us what we can cover in the next video.